A young billionaire crossed the polished marble floors of the New York headquarters she had owned and nurtured. Yet not a single person rose to greet her. No one recognized her face, and no one bothered to ask for her name or purpose in the building. Instead, they politely instructed her to wait in the cold hallway, as if she were a complete stranger, wandering off the bustling city streets. Meanwhile, on the other side of the expansive boardroom, concealed behind massive walls of frosted glass, the executives who ran her empire laughed and spoke of immense power, utterly convinced they held absolute control, never imagining that the true owner of the company was already sitting just a few feet away. Audrey Davis had been sitting in the sleek reception area of her own company for exactly 6 minutes, listening to 12 men laughing on the other side of the glass. Not a single employee had recognized her when she walked through the revolving front doors. The front desk assistant, a young woman named Chloe, wearing wireless headphones and a nervous, apologetic smile, had politely asked her to take a seat in the waiting area. The receptionist explained that the executive committee was currently in a highly private session and asked if she had a scheduled appointment. Audrey had chosen not to respond, her silence speaking volumes as the heavy vintage watch on her left wrist remained the only clue to her true identity. Nobody in the sprawling metropolis of New York had seen her in person for several weeks. Through the frosted glass of the boardroom, the blurred silhouettes moved with the arrogant confidence of those who firmly believe that nobody is watching their every move. One of them, a tall man wearing a striking maroon tie, pounded the wooden table amidst a chorus of raucous laughter. That was David Foster, the chief operating officer whom her late father had hired exactly 15 years ago, back when Audrey was still doing her middle school homework in the dusty back room of their first textile factory. David had always felt like an older brother to her, a trusted confidant, at least until exactly 3 weeks ago. Audrey had spent those past 3 weeks in the historic city of Boston, tirelessly negotiating and finally closing a massive expansion agreement that would effectively triple the manufacturing production of Vantage America along the East Coast. Every single Friday, she had sent a detailed progress report to the headquarters. Every single Friday, David had promptly replied with a reassuring, punctual executive summary, insisting that everything was completely under control and suggesting she should take some time to enjoy the beauty of Boston. She had wholeheartedly believed every word he wrote, trusting the man who had been a pillar of the company for over a decade. Her absolute trust shattered 2 days ago, when Matthew Reed, the veteran accountant who had spent 22 years meticulously looking after every single cent of the company, called her late at night. He was the exact same man who had patiently taught her how to read a complex balance sheet when she was barely 12 years old. He called her at exactly 11 o'clock at night, his usually steady voice trembling with an undeniable sense of panic. He told Audrey that she desperately needed to return to New York immediately, absolutely before 6 o'clock in the evening, on the following day. When she asked what was happening, he revealed they had convened an emergency board meeting for a massive capital expansion, claiming they had her explicit written authorization. Audrey vividly remembered feeling the solid floor of her rented Boston apartment suddenly tilt sharply beneath her feet. She firmly told Matthew that she had absolutely not authorized any such financial maneuver. Matthew had gravely replied that he knew that, which was exactly why he was calling her in the middle of the night. Vantage America was not merely a profitable corporate entity to her. It was the sacred legacy her grandmother, Clara Davis, had courageously built back in 1978, with just 4 simple weaving looms and a bank loan that nobody else wanted to give a single woman. It was the majestic textile empire her father, Robert Davis, had multiplied over 30 years to become the largest exporter of technical fabrics in the country. Ever since a sudden, devastating heart attack took her beloved father away, in less than an hour, exactly 4 years ago, Audrey had held a 51% direct inheritance stake. Legally, nobody could ever sell Vantage America without her explicit signature. But a sudden capital expansion was an entirely different beast altogether. If they managed to issue enough new company shares and quietly sold them to a predatory external investment fund, her 51% majority would instantly be diluted into a helpless minority. On paper, she would technically still own her original shares, but in ruthless corporate practice, she would lose executive control forever, stripping her family of their life's work. To legally authorize such a drastic emergency expansion without the physical presence of the majority shareholder, there was only one possible mechanism: a specialized power of attorney, formally signed by Audrey herself. She had indeed signed one exactly 2 years ago, specifically so David could approve minor operational expenses while she was finishing her advanced master's degree in Minneapolis. However, that specific legal document had a strict expiration date, and it had officially expired exactly 14 months ago. She had told Matthew she needed the original forged document to see exactly what they had presented to the notary, and he had promised to pull every string he had to get it before the 6 o'clock deadline. Now, sitting in that pristine glass-walled waiting room, Audrey calmly watched her own faint reflection, superimposed over the arrogant laughter of the men attempting to strip her of everything her family had built with their bare hands. Surprisingly, she did not feel a blinding rage. Instead, she felt something much colder, much more calculated, and infinitely more useful. She embraced absolute silence, because she had learned long ago from her wise grandmother that total silence was exactly where a devastating storm was always prepared. A particularly shrill laugh pierced the thick frosted glass, indicating David was telling another supposedly brilliant anecdote. Audrey did not even need to hear the specific words to recognize the smug tone in his voice. It was the exact same patronizing tone he always used whenever he managed to secure something that did not rightfully belong to him. Suddenly, her mobile phone vibrated intensely inside the pocket of her tailored navy jacket. It was an encrypted message from Matthew, stating he finally had the document, and that the signature on the notarized power of attorney was definitively not hers. The digital clock on the hallway wall ominously indicated there were exactly 40 minutes remaining until the emergency board meeting was scheduled to officially conclude. Audrey took a deep, steadying breath, gently touched her father's heavy watch on her wrist, and stared directly at the glass door where David Foster continued to laugh, entirely oblivious that the true owner of the empire was sitting a mere 4 meters away. She was patiently waiting for the precise, perfect moment to make her entrance and shatter their illusions. Just then, among the blurry, shifting silhouettes inside the bright room, one specific figure turned toward the hallway and froze completely still. The man who had turned was not David, it was Paul Sterling, the youngest financial analyst on the executive team. Barely in his early 20s, Paul stood completely paralyzed, his striped tie slightly crooked, his eyes wide as dinner plates, staring through the narrow, transparent gap in the glass design. He had instantly recognized Audrey from an old family photograph that still proudly hung in her late father's corner office. His hand hovered nervously midway toward the glass door handle, trapped between corporate duty and a sudden realization of impending doom. Audrey slowly shook her head, moving it barely a single millimeter, communicating a silent but absolute command. Paul understood instantly. He slowly lowered his trembling hand and turned back to the massive oak table, pretending to review financial papers he wasn't actually reading. The large analog clock on the hallway wall now displayed exactly 5:22 in the afternoon, meaning there were only 38 minutes left until the session was permanently adjourned. That was 38 excruciating minutes for Matthew to frantically rush across the chaotic city streets with the official forensic report, proving the signature was entirely fabricated. Audrey pulled out her mobile phone again and reread Matthew's terrifying 4-word message confirming her worst fears. Somebody highly sophisticated had completely fabricated a binding legal document using her identity, and it had to be someone with deep internal access to her old files and authentic signatures. She immediately thought of David, the man who had spent 15 years smoothly directing the company's daily operations, the man who always affectionately called her the little boss during warm family dinners. Then, her thoughts shifted to her formidable grandmother. Clara Davis was exactly 83 years old, and possessed a razor-sharp memory that was vastly more precise than any modern accounting software. She lived on the quiet outskirts of New York, in the exact same brick house where she had hand-stitched the very first technical patterns for Vantage America. Audrey quickly typed a brief, urgent message to her grandmother, asking for immediate assistance at the corporate headquarters. The reply from her grandmother arrived in less than 60 seconds, stating she already knew something was terribly wrong because David had been actively avoiding her phone calls for several weeks. Clara declared she was already in a private car, heading straight toward the towering office building. Audrey allowed a small, proud smile to touch her lips. Despite her advanced age, her grandmother never passively waited for instructions. She simply acted. Inside the soundproof room, the treacherous meeting was steadily continuing its course. Through the frosted glass, Audrey could clearly distinguish dark silhouettes, leaning eagerly forward, hands aggressively pointing at thick stacks of legal documents. She recognized another, much deeper voice that seemed to be completely dominating the current conversation. It belonged to Bruce Carter, the slick external advisor whom David had mysteriously brought into the executive fold exactly 8 months ago. Audrey had never fully trusted him, as he always spoke with far too much unwarranted arrogance for someone who had been with their historic company for such a remarkably short time. It was Bruce who had meticulously drafted the new corporate governance bylaws that the board of directors had hastily approved during the previous fiscal year. Bylaws that secretly contained a deeply buried loophole for accelerated capital expansion. That obscure legal loophole, explicitly designed for situations requiring urgent corporate liquidity, was the very mechanism they were currently exploiting. It was a treacherous institutional trap that she had unfortunately signed without reading carefully enough, foolishly trusting the brief executive summary David had handed her. The young receptionist, Chloe, cautiously approached Audrey again, offering a tall glass of sparkling water and asking if she was feeling all right, since she had been waiting for quite a while. Audrey accepted the glass with a perfectly calm voice, stating she was just waiting for someone special, and that there was absolutely no need to announce her presence. At exactly 5:34 in the afternoon, Audrey's phone vibrated violently against her palm once more. This time, it was a heavily encrypted email, forwarded by Matthew directly from his personal account, deliberately bypassing the compromised internal company servers. The subject line read, "Urgent handwriting forensic analysis," and Audrey opened the attached file with remarkably steady hands, even though her heart was pounding fiercely against her ribs. It was a comprehensive 2-page legal report, officially signed by a certified judicial expert whom Matthew had personally known and trusted for many years. The final conclusion, boldly underlined in bright red ink, was devastatingly clear. The signature on the power of attorney presented to the prestigious city notary absolutely did not match any authentic signature Audrey Davis had produced in the last 10 years. It had been flawlessly forged utilizing highly advanced cryptographic handwriting reproduction software, a rare technology that, according to the expert's notes, was only offered by a very select few specialized consulting firms in the country. Before miraculously joining Vantage America as an independent advisor, Bruce Carter had previously served as the chief executive officer of one of those exact specialized consulting firms. Audrey closed her eyes for a brief, agonizing second as the final puzzle piece forcefully clicked into place. This was absolutely not just David acting out of sudden blind ambition or immense executive burnout. This was a meticulously calculated conspiracy, constructed over many months. They had orchestrated this hostile takeover with the specialized help of someone who intimately knew exactly how to navigate the murky edges of corporate law without blatantly crossing them until the final strike. She felt a sharp, sudden pang of profound sadness, long before the righteous anger finally settled in. David had been a constant, reassuring presence in her life since she was only 14 years old. He had personally taught her how to operate a heavy textile press. He was the man who had taught her how to calculate profit margins and fiercely negotiate with stubbornly suspicious suppliers. Yet here he was, standing on the other side of a glass partition, flawlessly orchestrating her total financial ruin. Her phone screen lit up again. It was an internal encrypted message from Paul, taking a massive professional risk by texting her from his open laptop. He warned her they were going to initiate the final binding vote in exactly 15 minutes, and that Bruce was aggressively arguing that her physical presence was entirely unnecessary due to the notarized document. Paul frantically begged her to intervene immediately. Matthew would logically need at least 20 more minutes to navigate the heavy city traffic and arrive with the physical original documentation, the only tangible proof a judge would accept to legally nullify a fraudulent corporate vote. Audrey gracefully stood up for the very first time in more than 30 long minutes, meticulously smoothing the lapels of her navy blue jacket, which happened to be the exact same shade her late father always wore to his most critical corporate battles. She slowly checked the heavy vintage watch on her wrist one final time. Then, she purposefully walked straight toward the heavy glass door, absolutely determined to interrupt the treacherous vote. With her hand firmly resting on the cold steel handle, she suddenly heard David's voice projecting loudly and clearly across the room, speaking the exact words that made her pause for a fraction of a second. "Let us proceed directly to the final vote. Audrey Davis, as is widely known, is currently entirely out of the country and will unfortunately be unable to participate in today's emergency proceedings." The arrogant sentence hung heavily in the air, delivered with such absolute, unwavering confidence that not a single highly paid executive in the room even bothered to question its validity. Audrey tightened her grip on the steel handle, but did not turn it quite yet. Inside the tense room, the oldest and most respected board member, a distinguished man with a white beard named Isaac Pratt, slowly raised his weathered hand. He politely yet firmly stated that an aggressive capital expansion of this massive magnitude should definitely wait until Audrey could thoroughly review it in person. Isaac argued that even with a notarized document in play, pushing this forward felt incredibly reckless and rushed. David smoothly replied with that sickeningly calm voice that the timeline was severely limited and that the external investment fund, Crown Capital Partners, would completely withdraw their lucrative offer if they did not finalize the vote today. Bruce Carter immediately intervened, aggressively sliding a thick black folder across the polished oak table to visually intimidate the older board member. Bruce coldly stated that the legal power was completely validated before a licensed state notary, and therefore there was absolutely no legal impediment to proceeding immediately. Audrey felt her stomach twist into tight knots as she heard the name Crown Capital Partners, a corporate entity she had literally never heard mentioned in any official financial report. Still standing just outside the glass door, she discreetly pulled out her mobile phone and quickly typed the mysterious name into the search engine. The initial search results loaded almost instantly, revealing exactly what she had deeply feared. Crown Capital Partners was an obscure investment fund, officially registered barely 14 months ago, maintaining its supposed corporate headquarters inside a tiny, generic tax processing office in the state of Delaware. It possessed absolutely no public financial history, no publicly known corporate operations, and no trace of legitimate executive leadership. It was nothing but an empty corporate shell. Audrey instantly grasped the devastating magnitude of the entire criminal operation they had constructed behind her back. They were not merely attempting to dilute her majority ownership shares. They were systematically planning to sell the most critical, highly profitable assets of Vantage America to a ghost fund, a fund undoubtedly controlled by Bruce himself or his hidden associates, at a price disgustingly below its actual market value. Eventually, after a few quiet months, that ghost fund would aggressively resell those exact same premium assets, multiplying their illicit profits 100-fold. David and Bruce would quietly pocket the massive difference, and she would be left holding the meaningless title of a completely gutted, hollowed-out corporate shell. Her phone vibrated against her palm one more time, delivering a message from her grandmother. Clara stated she was exactly 10 minutes away and advised Audrey to completely trust Isaac Pratt, as he had always been fiercely loyal to her father. Audrey took a deep, shaky breath, finding a small sliver of comfort in knowing she had at least one genuine ally inside that den of thieves. Inside the room, the binding vote was steadily moving forward, as David confidently asked those in favor of approving the capital expansion to raise their right hands. 6 hands slowly but deliberately went up into the air. Audrey counted them from the outside, her heart relentlessly pounding against her throat. 6 out of 12. They desperately needed 7. Isaac Pratt stubbornly kept his weathered hand resting flat against the table. Paul Sterling, sitting nervously at the far end of the long room, also kept his hands firmly in his lap, though his darting eyes clearly betrayed the crushing weight of the moment. Bruce aggressively flipped through his legal notes and loudly declared they needed exactly one more vote to achieve the required majority. David slowly scanned the room, his eyes calculating exactly who he could pressure into tipping the delicate balance. It was at that exact, precarious second that Audrey firmly decided she absolutely could not wait another moment in the shadows. She turned the heavy steel handle and pushed the glass door wide open. The suffocating silence that instantly followed was absolute, so incredibly dense that even the circulated air conditioning seemed to completely stop flowing. 12 stunned heads snapped toward the doorway at the exact same time. David Foster visibly lost all color in his face, his mouth hanging slightly open as if he were staring directly at a terrifying ghost. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Audrey said with an incredibly serene, melodic voice, stepping slowly and deliberately into the bright room. "Please forgive my unexpected interruption, but I see you were voting on something rather critical regarding my company, entirely without me." Nobody dared to utter a single word in response. The sharp, sudden sound of Bruce's black folder slipping from his trembling fingers and hitting the wooden table was the only noise that dared to break the heavy silence. David stammered her name, desperately trying to recover his shattered composure with agonizing speed. He weakly claimed they all genuinely believed she was still far away in Boston, and that if they had known she was returning, they would have naturally waited. Audrey looked right through him and softly replied that she already knew that, which was exactly why nobody had bothered to notify her of this supposedly urgent gathering. She slowly walked around the massive wooden table, deliberately stopping right next to the large, empty leather chair at the head of the table, a seat that rightfully belonged to her as the majority shareholder. She deliberately chose not to sit down, preferring to stand and physically tower over the men who had plotted her downfall. She locked her piercing gaze directly onto Bruce Carter and calmly asked him to explain to the entire board why her historic company was about to sell its most strategic corporate assets to Crown Capital Partners, a 14-month-old entity based in a Delaware tax office that essentially did not exist outside of printed paper. Bruce's normally composed face visibly tightened, a subtle twitch betraying his rising panic, but he desperately attempted to maintain his professional facade. He arrogantly stated that the financial details of the investment fund were strictly confidential, and that he was absolutely not authorized to disclose them to the board. Audrey instantly cut him off, her voice slicing through his pathetic defense like a sharpened steel blade, clarifying that she had never asked if he was authorized. She had explicitly asked him why. Isaac Pratt, the distinguished older board member, leaned heavily forward, scrutinizing Bruce with a potent mixture of profound shock and deep suspicion. Isaac turned his intense gaze toward David and bluntly demanded to know if the chief operating officer had been entirely aware of this dubious information. David evasively stammered that he had fully trusted Bruce's supposedly independent financial analysis and blindly insisted that the entire corporate procedure had strictly followed all appropriate legal channels. Audrey maintained her absolute chilling calm, declaring that the entire fraudulent process heavily relied on a notarized document that she absolutely never signed, making every word weigh like a massive stone. A shocked murmur quickly rippled across the crowded room as several board members turned aggressively toward David for an explanation. Bruce spoke far too quickly, his voice cracking slightly as he claimed that such an accusation was entirely impossible, because the legal document had been thoroughly validated by a licensed state notary. Audrey fiercely challenged him, demanding to know exactly who had supposedly verified that fraudulent signature. Nobody dared to offer a response to her devastating question. Suddenly, Audrey's mobile phone vibrated heavily in her tailored pocket once again. It was a rapid message from Matthew confirming he was finally inside the corporate building, riding the elevator up, and bringing the physical original documents with him. Audrey slowly lifted her piercing gaze back to David. David no longer resembled the arrogantly confident executive who had been laughing hysterically just an hour earlier. He looked entirely broken. Audrey coolly suggested they proceed with their precious vote, but only after they welcomed a very special guest she wanted everyone in the room to intimately know. The heavy boardroom door swung open once again, this time with a forceful, commanding thud, and in the doorway stood an elderly woman with perfectly pinned white hair and a gaze forged from solid iron. Clara Davis leaned heavily on a beautifully polished wooden cane that had once proudly belonged to the original founder of the vast textile empire. Clara Davis greeted the terrified room, her narrowed eyes slowly scanning the space, as if she were simultaneously recognizing every single face and every single lie hidden behind them. She sarcastically noted that she had seemingly arrived just in time for the most interesting part of the afternoon. Clara advanced slowly toward the center of the massive room, with the undeniable authority of a woman who had fiercely walked those exact same floors for 46 years. Absolutely nobody dared to interrupt the heavy silence as she deliberately paused to inspect each executive. Finally, she locked her intimidating gaze directly onto David Foster. Without raising her raspy voice, Clara calmly reminded David that she vividly remembered him as a scrawny 12-year-old boy stealing sweet apples from her backyard garden. She coldly added that she never once imagined he would grow up to steal something infinitely more valuable from her own family. David instantly dropped his gaze to the polished table, utterly incapable of maintaining eye contact with the strong woman who had practically watched him grow into adulthood. He weakly whispered her name, pathetically attempting to claim that the complicated situation was absolutely not what it seemed. Clara slowly lowered herself into the leather chair Audrey respectfully pulled out for her. Clara sternly instructed David to explain himself, warning him he had exactly the amount of time it took for her granddaughter to calmly drink a single glass of water. A suffocating, utterly agonizing silence permanently settled over the luxurious boardroom. Bruce Carter desperately attempted to intervene to save his crumbling scheme, but Clara swiftly raised a wrinkled, uncompromising hand, silencing him instantly before a single word could escape his throat. She sharply informed the slick advisor that she had absolutely not asked for his unsolicited opinion, and that if she ever desired to hear it, it certainly would not be any time soon. Audrey, standing tall and resolute by the expansive glass window, felt a sudden, profound warmth blooming amidst the toxic corporate tension. Her incredible grandmother still possessed the uncanny, magical ability to completely dominate an entire room of powerful men without ever needing to raise her voice above a quiet whisper. Just then, the heavy boardroom door opened for the third time, revealing a heavily panting Matthew Reed, his usually pale face flushed bright red from sprinting across the city. He firmly clutched a thick leather folder securely under his arm. He had worked tirelessly for the Davis family for 22 years, and Audrey had never seen him so frantic. Matthew gasped lightly for air, swiftly apologizing for the abrupt intrusion, but firmly declared he brought critical forensic information the entire board absolutely needed to examine before proceeding with any binding vote. David made one last, desperate attempt to reassert his shattered authority, nervously claiming this was a highly classified executive committee meeting and totally inappropriate for an accountant to interrupt. Audrey instantly overruled him, her voice echoing with absolute command, instructing Matthew to proceed without delay. The loyal accountant carefully opened the worn leather folder and meticulously extracted two highly sensitive documents, placing them onto the polished oak table with extreme reverence. Matthew pointed to the first crisp dash, identifying it as the highly disputed power of attorney officially presented to the state registry earlier that very morning. He then dramatically pointed to the second document, revealing it as a certified forensic handwriting analysis conducted by a fully licensed judicial expert, conclusively proving the signature absolutely did not belong to Audrey Davis. Isaac Pratt eagerly leaned over the wide table, hastily adjusting his reading glasses to meticulously examine the damning paperwork. He quietly muttered that this was an incredibly serious criminal violation. Matthew fiercely agreed, adding he had thoroughly checked the official notary communication logs. Matthew revealed that the original phone appointment to authorize that fraudulent power of attorney was suspiciously booked exactly 3 weeks ago from a registered internal corporate phone line, absolutely not from Audrey's personal mobile device. Isaac immediately demanded to know exactly which internal phone extension was used for the criminal act. Matthew hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing briefly at Audrey, who offered an almost imperceptible nod of absolute approval. Matthew firmly stated the call originated directly from the private executive office belonging to Bruce Carter. Instantly, every single pair of eyes in the massive room viciously turned toward Bruce, whose face had drained of all blood. Bruce's voice cracked pathetically as he desperately labeled the undeniable accusation as completely absurd, frantically arguing that literally anyone with basic building access could have sneaked into his office to use that specific phone line. Matthew remained remarkably calm, countering that they would also need access to the highly restricted cryptographic handwriting software that Bruce's former consulting agency had exclusively developed exactly 4 years ago. The silence that immediately followed was vastly different from the previous tension. It was the incredibly heavy, undeniable silence of absolute truth, finally locking into its rightful place. Clara slowly stood back up, leaning heavily on her wooden cane. She walked deliberately until she stood directly in front of the trembling advisor. With a terrifyingly calm voice, she explained that her late husband had built this massive empire with his bare, calloused hands, starting with only 4 simple looms. She passionately recounted how her brilliant son had multiplied that humble beginning over 30 years, yet Bruce foolishly believed he could steal their entire legacy with a single laptop and a fabricated signature. Isaac Pratt violently slammed the leather folder shut, a sound that echoed like a judge's final gavel. He loudly announced he was officially withdrawing his vote and fiercely demanded the entire process be immediately annulled, pending a criminal investigation. The remaining board members, who just an hour ago had blindly supported the malicious capital expansion, now visibly squirmed in their expensive leather chairs, nervously exchanging horrified glances. Martin, another prominent executive, quickly raised his hand, frantically declaring he was also completely withdrawing his support, pleading he had absolutely no idea the legal document was utterly fraudulent. David Foster, still standing rigidly near the head of the long table, suddenly looked as though he had aged 10 agonizing years in a mere 10 minutes. Audrey stepped intimately close to him, stating they did not need to make a massive public spectacle in front of the entire board. She firmly told him this was simply the harsh truth, finally stepping into the bright light, right in the exact room where he had desperately tried to bury it. She stopped right in front of him, speaking in a low, intensely private whisper that only the two of them could clearly hear, even though the entire room remained dead silent. She softly reminded him that she had deeply trusted him for 15 consecutive years, allowing him to heavily guide the company after her father passed away, because she genuinely believed he loved the legacy just as much as her father did. David's eyes instantly filled with thick, shameful tears. He weakly whispered that he truly did love the company, but the entire complicated situation had completely spiraled out of his control. He pathetically attempted to shift the blame, claiming Bruce had expertly convinced him this was the absolutely only way to save the vast empire from a massive, impending liquidity crisis. Audrey stared at him with genuine, unadulterated shock, questioning what imaginary financial crisis he was even talking about, since the meticulous internal financial reports she reviewed every single week showed incredibly solid, highly profitable numbers. David slowly lowered his tear-filled eyes in absolute shame, and in that devastating gesture, Audrey realized he had heavily manipulated those reports too. Clara, still standing fiercely by the large window, raised her wooden cane and pointed it directly at the heavy boardroom doors. She coldly advised the young advisor that it was definitely time to frantically call a criminal defense attorney, and certainly not to negotiate a golden parachute severance package. Bruce hastily gathered his scattered papers with violently trembling hands, keeping his mouth completely shut, fully aware that any desperate attempt at self-defense would sound incredibly hollow against the mountain of physical evidence. Audrey pivoted slowly toward the rest of the stunned board of directors, who were watching her with a potent mixture of deep respect, profound shock, and immense shame. With the quiet, unwavering authority of a true leader who never needed to shout to command absolute obedience, Audrey officially announced that the malicious voting session was permanently annulled. She boldly declared that from this exact second forward, she was personally assuming direct, aggressive supervision of every single strategic executive decision within Vantage America. Absolutely nobody dared to voice a single objection. It was precisely then that Paul Sterling, the brave young financial analyst who had recognized her from the very beginning, timidly raised his hand into the air. With an insecure yet determined voice, he softly called out Audrey's name, stating there was something else she desperately needed to know. Every eye snapped back to the young man. Audrey gently encouraged him to speak freely, feeling a deep sense of dread that this incredibly long afternoon was only just beginning to reveal the true depths of the betrayal. Paul swallowed hard, heavily wiping his sweating palms on his trousers. He shockingly revealed that David absolutely did not act out of blind ambition or merely because he was manipulated by Bruce's slick corporate lies. Paul explained he had spent the last 2 days meticulously digging through the highly restricted international wire transfer archives. He had discovered massive regular cash payments meticulously funneled over the past 8 months. Paul revealed these massive payments flowed directly from a hidden offshore account deeply tied to Crown Capital Partners, landing straight into a secret personal banking account officially registered under David Foster's name. David's tear-stained face completely collapsed in absolute horror, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whisper as he weakly tried to deny the undeniable accusation. He repeated that it was not true, but his hollow voice already reeked of absolute defeat rather than genuine defense. Paul calmly slid his glowing laptop toward the absolute center of the long oak table, physically turning the bright screen so every single executive in the room could clearly witness the undeniable digital proof. Paul nervously pointed directly at a long, organized column of specific dates and massive financial figures. He explained that exactly every 15 days for the past 8 months, the exact same massive amount of money was seamlessly transferred from the exact same Shell intermediary account connected to the Ghost Fund. Isaac Pratt pushed his reading glasses higher up his nose, intensely studying the glowing screen with a deeply furrowed brow. The older executive quietly muttered that this was absolutely not a legitimate corporate loan or a standard consulting commission. It was a highly sophisticated, meticulously structured corporate bribery operation. David practically collapsed into his heavy chair. David buried his face in his trembling hands, brokenly whispering to the silent room that he desperately needed that immense amount of cash. He confessed his youngest daughter had fallen terribly ill exactly 1 year ago, and the outrageously expensive experimental private clinic treatments were constantly draining his standard executive salary. Audrey felt a sudden, painful tightening in her chest, a brief flash of genuine human empathy, though it was nowhere near enough to legally justify the absolute destruction of her family's legacy. She softly told him that if he had just been honest and asked for help, she would have moved heaven and earth to support him as family, not merely as an employer. David kept his wet eyes glued to the polished table, sobbing quietly that his foolish, suffocating pride completely prevented him from begging for charity from the young daughter of the great man who had originally given him everything he had. Clara slowly shook her silver head, her voice filled with ancient wisdom and profound sorrow. She stated that foolish, misunderstood pride had violently destroyed far more good families than any standard economic recession ever could, and that David should have absolutely known better after spending so many years by her side. Suddenly, a commotion broke out near the hallway doors. Thomas Vance, the company's head of building security, burst into the room. Thomas was heavily panting, his security badge swinging wildly against his broad chest. He quickly apologized to Audrey for the massive interruption, but urgently declared that someone highly sophisticated was currently attempting a massive external cyber breach on the central corporate servers. He explained the hostile attack had begun exactly 3 minutes ago, originating from an unknown external IP address. Although the automated firewall had temporarily blocked the intrusion, the invisible hackers knew exactly which heavily encrypted folders to target, specifically aiming to permanently erase the sensitive internal audit files and the damning wire transfer logs from the past 12 months. Matthew immediately jumped to his feet, eyes wide with alarm. Paul's fingers instantly flew across his laptop keyboard in a frantic blur, furiously tracing the hostile digital connection. After 3 agonizing minutes of heavy silence, Paul triumphantly announced he had successfully bypassed the dynamic proxy mask. The vicious cyber attack was originating directly from a high-end corporate law firm located in downtown New York. Specifically, a prestigious office managed entirely by Bruce Carter's closest associates. Bruce turned an ashen shade of gray, completely cornered by his own digital arrogance. Within minutes, heavily armed city police officers, guided by Thomas Vance, entered the boardroom and officially placed both Bruce and David under strict arrest for massive corporate fraud and digital espionage. As the disgraced executives were silently escorted out, Audrey's phone buzzed with an untraceable encrypted text message that read, "This is absolutely not over. The fund has vastly more powerful partners than you could ever imagine." Paul quickly traced the original $2 million of seed money that had launched the Ghost Fund 14 months prior. The room froze, as Paul revealed the silent financial backer was Mark Andrews, her late father's absolute oldest and most trusted friend, a man who currently held a tiny 2% minority share in the company. Mark had secretly financed the entire hostile takeover simply out of ancient, festering jealousy, hoping to multiply his tiny share into a massive fortune. Mark frantically called Audrey's phone minutes later, begging for absolute forgiveness and pathetically blaming the entire criminal scheme on Bruce's manipulation. Audrey calmly placed him on speakerphone for the entire board to hear, coldly informing him that her father never once needed to maliciously deceive his closest friends to achieve massive success. She firmly stated he was absolutely not a victim, but a willing criminal accomplice, and abruptly ended the call, permanently severing their lifelong ties. 3 months later, the warm afternoon sun bathed the newly transparent glass walls of the massive boardroom. David was serving a significantly reduced prison sentence for full cooperation, while his sick daughter received world-class medical care, fully funded by a private employee charity Audrey had quietly established. Bruce and Mark faced devastating federal sentences and complete asset forfeiture. Standing peacefully beside the 4 beautifully restored original textile looms proudly displayed in the modernized corporate lobby, Audrey softly smiled at her formidable grandmother. She had successfully purged the toxic rot from her empire and rebuilt it stronger than ever. Audrey realized that true wealth is not measured by the numbers on a balance sheet, but by the unwavering integrity of the people who stand beside you when the foundations shake. A genuine legacy cannot simply be inherited through legal documents. It must be fiercely protected, continuously nurtured, and actively earned every single day. She learned that while desperate circumstances may easily tempt good people into making devastating choices, holding firmly to one's moral compass is the only reliable way to navigate the darkest storms. Ultimately, a forged signature can temporarily steal a company, but it can never replicate the profound resilience, the absolute truth, and the enduring honorable spirit of a family united by genuine love and unyielding respect.